I know what I was doing on the second Thursday of March in the year 1980 at 10 o'clock in the evening, Eastern Daylight Time. Often, I can't even remember if I've left the lights on in the car, where I put the keys down or something, so that I cannot remember a simple, more useful thing like that. Where is the mayonnaise or the tartar sauce at Kroger? It's never where I think it ought to be. But I can remember what I was doing on the second Thursday of March in 1980 at 10 o'clock in the evening. I wasn't the only one. Millions of people were doing the very same thing. We were watching the #1 show on television at the time, Dallas, which introduced the whole soap opera to evening television. Dallas spawned a number of other similarly really addicting soap operas. Dynasty, I think, was the first to come. Knots Landing was a spin-off from Dallas. And then you had Falcon Crest. Then it became a mess. But at least that was must-see TV back in the day. Now, some of you are younger and you may not get this concept, so I'm going to tell you that in 1980 there was ABC, NBC, and CBS. FOX had not yet really done much of anything. Channel 41 was an independent station. Most people basically had three choices in the evening, and so it was something when the nation was kind of watching all the same program. This was the final episode of the third season of Dallas. And if you know anything about the Dallas, it's a story about the Ewings and their oil business in Texas. And of course, it's a little bit about oil and money, and it's an awful lot about a really highly dysfunctional family, which is kind of the whole point of soap opera. By the third season, Larry Hagman's character, J.R. Ewing, had become so central to the story. He's the story's villain. He's almost always behind every bad thing that happens in the show, with only rare bursts of humanity to show that he's a real human being. But he's more interesting to watch when he's being villainous. As the season was coming to an end, the final episode was on. He was irritating every person in the cast. That was noticeable as you watched the episode. That everyone was angry with him. So when you got to the final minutes of the season, he's by himself at work at night, and he hears a sound, and he steps up from his office and he says, "Who's there?" The next thing you see is a hand and an arm coming through the door holding a gun. 3 shots are fired out, and JR slumps to the floor, and the season of Dallas just came to its end. The cliffhanger, as they call it, which was the audience was left saying, "Oh my goodness, is he alive? Oh my goodness, who shot him?" It was the first time in television history that a season ended this way, that it left people hanging, that it didn't give any type of certainty, that they had to wait to see what was going to happen. That's why we call it the cliffhanger. Since then, many television series have tried to do the same thing. Even Dallas went there again a few years ago. The younger son, Bobby, died at the end of one season. That wasn't a cliffhanger. But at the end of the next season, suddenly he was in the shower in the morning, and we were to believe that the entire year had been a dream. That's called a cliffhanger. That did not work. And I don't really remember where I was when that was on that particular evening. But the Dallas cliffhanger, because of it, so captivated people. And when the series returned in the fall, back then the new series would always start in September. Again, now, unimaginable. No streaming, no recording. You had to wait till the television showed the program. The Screen Actors Guild went on strike, and so the whole television season was held up by almost 2 months, which built up pent-up demand, not just in the United States, but around the world, wanting to know who shot JR, and the advertisers wanting this to be dragged out about as long as they could get. It would be the third Thursday in November of that very same year that the famous episode where JR's shooter was revealed was done. And so all of this simply reminds us of the power of a cliffhanger that leaves you wanting to know what happened. And I think the apostles experienced the ascension as a cliffhanger. You know, there's only 2 accounts that we get in the Gospels. Mark, which we heard tonight, Luke, which we will hear next year. In the A year, which was last year, we hear Matthew, which doesn't even mention the ascension at all. So the two accounts we hear are similar. Mark is the oldest of the four Gospels, so it's the first one that was written. And so the ascension, as you heard tonight, you heard the conclusion of the Gospel of Mark this evening. In that story, Jesus is just simply lifted up to heaven after he says some important things to his apostles, commissioning them to go out and make disciples of the rest of the earth. It's Luke that will add a little more to the story. And in Luke's version, which, by the way, you heard his recap of his version in our first reading, the Acts of the Apostles could be called Luke Part 2. It's written by the author of Luke, although it was written a little bit later. It tells the story of the early church. So Luke ends with the ascension scene that's completely rewritten into the very beginning of Acts of the Apostles, and you always hear it on Ascension Sunday, no matter what year that we're in. In that particular story, additional detail comes up. A cloud is part of the lifting mechanism for Jesus to ascend, although that doesn't give you and I very much concrete information, does it? But it has a wonderful feature you heard in the story tonight that it really caught my attention. The apostles, looking up as Jesus is lifted up into the sky, are suddenly look up and they see a vision of two angels. We've seen this before. When the women came to the tomb on Easter Sunday, there were angels telling them, why are you looking for him? The one you're looking for is not here. Now the angels are telling to the apostles, why are you looking at the sky? You know, the obvious question is, the cloud just came and lifted him up. You would look too. But you see, the angels are asking a theological question. Why are you looking up there? You know, the idea literally almost like this is a cliffhanger. What's going to happen next? And you see, as Acts of the Apostles then begins, there is no next. Well, there is a next. We're going to get to that. But the next is not evident to the apostles. They've seen this amazing thing, and now they wonder what is going to happen. And isn't it that way with us? Our lives are often a cliffhanger. And as a result, it comes with a human desire for certainty, which means you haven't invented this need in the postmodern era. That I think since we've been sentient, intelligent human beings and had some sense of intelligence, began to learn something about our world, we would always like to find a way to make it all make sense. That's why people study science and mathematics. If you look at the books long enough, you'll finally get the equation to everything, although you never seem to do that. That relentless search for certitude is also part of our spiritual journey. And as I'm sure you know, certitude is always the thing most lacking in any spiritual journey. The cliffhanger is a far more obvious phenomenon of the spiritual journey. Anytime we find ourselves in a situation where we feel imperiled, or we feel endangered, or we feel confused, or we feel marginalized, and that happens to all of us in many different ways, our spirituality is deeply affected by a need to know what's going to happen next. At the big moments in our life, we had a beautiful wedding yesterday. Our sacristan's daughter got married, and they're back here at church tonight. You know, every wedding I ever celebrated, it occurs to me that there's this climactic moment. The couple's dressed to the nines, and we've had this beautiful celebration with all of the music, and no one has any idea what's going to happen next. Oh yeah, they're going to go to the too much, but I don't mean that. The rest of their lives are completely uncharted. No one really knows. You might say it's a cliffhanger, and that's the way our lives work. And the pandemic, which we are now emerging out of, you may not have noticed, but you can now sit in any of the pews you want to sit in, although most of you have managed to distribute yourself every other pew. But that's just a democratic choice you can make now. You can actually sit in each of them if you would like. And perhaps very soon more of the restrictions are going to be lifted. I'm almost certain that they will be. But this whole experience we've had of the pandemic illustrates the cliffhanger quality that happens in our life. A little over a year ago, when the news of it started coming around, it was news that was coming in bits and pieces and often contradictory. It's very difficult to get anything definitive about it. They knew it started in China, and then they knew that people were getting sick, and then stay off the cruise ship. They knew that next. And then suddenly it was everywhere, and you couldn't figure out how it was going to happen. And the guidance we got, first the CDC said, don't wear masks, there's not enough of them. Then they said, wear a mask. And they thought, well, I thought you said don't wear a mask. Then they said, wear 2 masks, making me wonder, are they going to finally say 5? I mean, when are they going to stop at some particular level? How are we going to work in the world? So we all encountered the pandemic with all of that emotional roller coaster, the closing of churches, restaurants, stores, all different things we happen, the shutdown of our economy, making us wonder if things ever going to be normal again. Almost like JR slumped on the floor of viewing oil. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen next? The apostles looking up at the sky. He's gone. Now what? And you and I approaching all of those cliffhangers, wondering what is coming. And you see in the spiritual life, what Jesus is revealing to us in the ascension, that the cliffhanger makes us look forward. We're looking to see what happens next. This is usually unsatisfactory for most people that like more certainty in their life, which, by the way, is every living human being that I know. In John's gospel, Jesus, aware of this trait of human nature, speaking to the apostles at the Last Supper, his final discourse, we've been hearing it on the previous Sundays, he says to them, I have many more things to tell you, but you cannot bear it now. And John's gospel ends with an interesting line that there are many more things that Jesus did that are not recorded in this book. And then he writes his final sentence, I doubt there are enough books in the world to contain them all. There we are, once again, always having to face no explanation, no certitude, no anything. Well, there is some certitude. You know that when you come and celebrate Eucharist tonight, that with certitude, the bread, and as long as I live that long, the bread and the wine will become the body and blood of Jesus Christ. You're safe because there's enough in the tabernacle if I have an untimely demise. Please at least call EMS before you do all of that. But with certitude, we will receive the body and blood of our risen Lord. Sacraments are certain things when they're celebrated in the right and proper way. And so in a world that's so unpredictable, so crazy, that leaves us hanging, wondering what we're doing, the sacraments are not just signs to us, which indeed they are, but they are the certain principles that keep our mind focused, or as I said at the beginning, our eyes on the finish line. It's easy to imagine it in this beautiful church because of that beautiful dome that's above us, with the blue skies showing this sense of heaven and the eye of God looking down there in the center of it, that the idea that we're going to be lifted up, rising up into the heavenly dome is a really powerful notion you can see by just physically being present here in this church. That's the finish line. And you see, death is the final cliffhanger. Every one of us, first of all, experiences with the death of our loved ones. It's always difficult because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's happened. The day Michael died, I just stared at him and I thought, where are you? And I just didn't even know what to think. Now, as I look back on it, I was just completely in shock. But when you're in shock, you don't realize you're in shock. You really only know that later when you kind of get the sense of your behavior. All of us have had that experience, and then none of us have had the experience of what it's like to die, because we're all living. That's why we're here this evening. So all we can do is anticipate it, and isn't that the mother of all cliffhangers? Because basically whatever happens then, that's going to be eternity. And so this is the way that we live our lives, of almost kind of perpetual cliffhanger. You know, when Dallas started its fourth season, they went about 4 episodes before they announced they would reveal who shot JR. So I remember where I was that third Thursday in 1980 when that episode came at 10 o'clock at night. And of course, they waited into the final minute. And if you remember the show at all, Kristen, who was Sue Ellen's sister, she's the wife of JR, the one who had the biggest motive to kill him in the first place, that the sister actually had killed him. And it was a resolution to the drama, but of course the story continued. It sort of reminds me of this whole thing about a cliffhanger. Its purpose, and their purpose indeed, was to keep us focused on the story. Their purpose was to keep us watching what's going to happen next. You know, when the apostles look up at the heaven and are looking at the sky and there's no sense of what's going to happen next, I can definitively tell you that you'll find out. But you'll have to come back next week to find out. And when you do, you'll see why I struggled with the end of this homily. I always had the same ending, but I kept thinking it was an abrupt ending. But it always seems to work out, no matter how many times I re-edited my way around it. We don't know what's going to happen next. To tell you to come back next week To find out the rest of the story simply reminds us about life and about our faith. It's a cliffhanger.